Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And I got kids, we've talked about that before. And every now and then, they'll come home and be telling me an elaborate story about something that was so interesting. Like, well, we went down to the little bit of water that runs back there behind the house, and we found a turtle, and we were looking for things, and it was really interesting. And then Kelly punched Tommy, and then we found another turtle. And I'm like, whoa, okay, hold on a second. Now, I can tell that you were excited about the turtles, and that's the big reason that you wanted to tell me the story. But I guess I was curious about Kelly punching Tommy. Tell me more about that. But the reality is that if all I got was a recording of the kids relaying what their event looking for turtles down in the water was like, and I wasn't able to ask questions and get feedback, I would have to take something into account here in terms of how I interpret it. And that would be that the primary purpose, this is going to feel like your old ACT prep class for the English section, I would have to acknowledge that the primary purpose of their story was not to tell me about whatever the little dust-up was between, I don't even remember what names I made up now, Kelly and Tommy. It sounds like names from a Bon Jovi song, something like that, whatever. That wasn't the point. The point of their story was that there were turtles and they were excited about the turtles. And so any details about this little dust-up that happened, I would have a difficult time piecing together, and I have to interpret their story in light of the fact that the thing they most wanted to relay to me was not some ancillary conflict, but it was there were turtles and we found them. When we get to Matthew chapter 16, we run into a very delicate passage. And it's unfortunate that it's delicate because it's awesome. It's the emotional high point of the whole thing. It's the celebratory, all right, well, now this is out in the open. We've ripped off the duct tape, and now we can say just exactly how the things are because we're being honest with each other. But church history being what church history is, the passage that you and I are looking at right now in Matthew chapter 16 has a second level of meaning. And it's not really what Matthew was trying to report to us or what he's most excited about here, but it is a really important secondary question that comes up, and that is how much of what's going on here in Matthew chapter 16, where Peter is the one who confesses that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, how much of this exchange that he has with Jesus is about that confession, and how much of this passage is about the role of Peter and his uniquely blessed state and what Jesus meant and what that means moving forward. So let me read the passage here, and then we're going to break that down a little bit more. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning of this thing, Matthew 16:13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they replied, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. For those of you who have been around Christianity for a long time, you probably quickly recognize that this passage right here is not just one of the theological high points of the entire Bible, the entire religion, but it's also one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible because there are a group of Christians who historically would call themselves the one universal Catholic Church. This is the church that is headquartered in the Vatican, associated with Rome. This expression of Christianity would say, well, clearly in this passage, Jesus is uniquely conferring authority to Peter, and he's saying that he's going to build his church on Peter, and therefore where Peter goes and where Peter eventually one day confers his authority, that becomes the new authority holders of the church, whereas everyone other than Catholics look at this passage and say, no, this doesn't explicitly say that that transfer of authority is uniquely happening with Peter here, and something else is occurring in Jesus' statement of blessing. So if you've been around Christianity for a long time, this passage is going to conjure those two things for you. If you haven't been around Christianity for a long time, you're probably looking at this and you're like, what's the fuss? Jesus has this question that's looming out there throughout all of the book of Matthew, and finally somebody's brave enough to just say it, and Jesus is like, boom, yes, absolutely, that is right. Blessed are you. And there's this whole big gigantic thing that's going to come out of it. But as much as I would love to minimize it for the sake of just rolling past it and getting on to the next passage, you can't, because the 2,000 years of church history that have happened in the interim are real. And no matter how much we would like to imagine that we come to the biblical text or really any cultural text and give it this clean, tidy read where we're like, oh, well, it's because I am above all of this and I am untainted by anything and all of my ideas and observations happen in a vacuum. This clearly means this. That's a joke. That's a myth. Nobody can do that. That isn't how things work. No ideas happen in a vacuum. So because of that, we have to unpack this whole thing in a little more detailed way. And there's no way we're going to get through all of that today. So it's going to be a couple-day project. All right, so Peter makes this proclamation, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus is like, right on, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. So at least in the case of this first verse of Jesus' response, what we are seeing is something that's reminiscent of the turtle story. Matthew is framing up Jesus' response. Jesus is giving this response because Jesus and Matthew are metaphorically like, we found turtles. It was amazing. They're excited, not about the potential controversy that comes out of it. That's not where their focus is. Their focus is on, well, you are correct, and this is from God. And how do I know that this was Matthew's priority here? And I mean really know that this was his priority? Well, two ways. One, the big picture of the whole book is obviously to point out that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the King who's starting this new kingdom. It's not hard. If you read all of Matthew, you can tell that's why Matthew wrote it. I don't think anybody disagrees that that's what this document is pointing everybody toward. So if that's the main point of the document, some argument that would come later after the fact regarding church authority and the possible unique authority of Peter, I mean, that just wouldn't be the main point of emphasis here. It hasn't come up. It hasn't been the point of the book at any point to this point. And so from a literary context perspective, it would make no sense for Matthew to be like, okay, surprise, now we're doing this whole new thing. Like if this was the writing team that gave you Game of Thrones Season 8 or the Star Wars sequel trilogy, okay, then maybe. But this isn't that. This is good. It's well written. It's carefully structured. But the second way I think we can know is a little bit more nuanced, but still pretty evident. Matthew takes all this time to develop this theme of eyes to see and ears to hear, and to develop this concept that all of that stuff is from God, that it is God who opens eyes and God who makes it possible for people to track with what's going on. If you just flip back a few pages to Matthew chapter 13, which is the third of 5 great discourses around which the book of Matthew is structured, this is the one about the kingdom parables. He tells a parable, and then the disciples come to him and they're like, why do you speak to the people in parables? And in verse 11, Jesus says, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. And then a little bit earlier on, there's that language coming off of the question regarding whether Jesus is the true Messiah from John the Baptist's disciples. And Jesus spells out in 11:25, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this was your good pleasure. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So it's pretty clear right there. And then you jump back a little bit further to chapter 9, and you get the stuff about the 2 blind men who followed him, and they're like, have mercy on us, Son of David. And this motif of eyes to see and ears to hear and God's work with that is introduced there as well. There's a reason that this theme has been developed, that God is the one who opens eyes, and God is the one who ultimately is the revealer of these most profound truths. That theme is there for a reason, and we're getting that payoff in chapter 16. So plain and simple, before we get into the very valid question of this historical theological controversy born out of this passage regarding Peter and what the implications are of this blessing that Jesus utters toward him, before we get into any of that, I just don't want to miss the point that Matthew is excited about. I don't want to miss the turtles part of the story here. And the turtles part of the story is Simon Peter nailed it. Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah, and Jesus is affirming that. Further, we're getting a very significant payoff on a theme that has been developing, a tension that has been developing, and that is, how would you know who Jesus is? Well, apparently it's not entirely just by mental math, but ultimately it's God who makes this evident to someone, or maybe even, and this is a difficult thing, not evident to someone. So if Jesus and Matthew and Peter all agree, first and foremost, that what they're excited about in this passage is Jesus, is the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the King that was long promised, that is going to establish this kingdom, then I think we're positioned well to consider some of the wrinkles and further debate and implications that come out of how Jesus phrases this blessing to Peter. And that, my friends, is what we are going to do next time around. Hey, quick note, though, for those of you who are more in the I'm an observer and I think this is interesting part of the crowd, I know what it feels like to get into some of this church history, theology, argument kind of stuff. And I know it can feel very overwhelming. And there's a psychological impulse when you run into this kind of inside baseball stuff to be like, oh, gross. It's this beautiful thing. How can people disagree or fight about it? And the reality is people are going to fight about anything, but sometimes people fight about Christian stuff because they're just being chumps. And because Christians are humans and we're all chumps, and sometimes we act like chumps, and we fight about things because we're turfy and territorial, and we want our thing to be right, and we want to look right, and we have a bunch of sunk cost in one thing, or maybe even blood got shed over something, and so we can't afford mentally to be wrong on a position here or there. Christians are people, and they will fight about things for the same reasons that people will fight about things. But another reason that Christians argue about stuff sometimes is because they take it super, super seriously. They think there's actually a God behind it and that this has gigantic implications, and they want to get it right. And they think on some of these points, getting it right is worth really doubling down on and being like, whoa, wait a minute. What does the Bible actually say? What do we do with this stuff? And so again, I completely understand how jarring it can be to walk into one of these points of historical Christian disagreement as an outsider, and even how disrupting it can be to a process of faith or even just appreciation of a religion that you're not going to sign up for. But I think if we can assume the sanity and give the benefit of the doubt to people we might disagree with, who take something very seriously or get very excited about something that we don't see quite what the big deal is, then we're more likely to not just understand the biblical text, but we're more likely to understand what people have done with it and understand our neighbors. And hopefully that intellectual grace and patience with each other, as we don't all share the same hot button issues, is something that gets reciprocated and just makes us all better at thinking about ideas together. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.